The bowl was my grandmother's, chipped blue enamel, a hairline crack she had glazed over herself. Older than me, I had carried it across the country in a padded box like it was a relic. And that morning I set it on the pass of the most feared kitchen in the country, under a lamp so hot it dried my eyes, with 3 cameras a hand's width from my face. My name is Odette Fenn. I was 26, an omega, a plater, the cook who dresses the plate and never gets to sign it. The woman on the other side of the pass was Chef Sévrine Adler, 38, 3 stars, the alpha the whole trade called the frost of the pass. She looked at my grandmother's stew for a long time. Something moved through her face and then went out like a pilot light. She pushed the bowl back at me across the steel, picked up a spoon and held it out. She said one word. She said, "Taste it."
Welcome, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
She made me eat my own failure on camera. That is the moment I have lived inside ever since. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe.
Let me back up first.
I did not grow up in kitchens with cameras. I grew up in one kitchen, a narrow counter with 8 stools on a harbor that smelled of salt and diesel, and underneath, always, saffron. My grandmother ran it. Rosa Fenn, everyone called her Meme, even people who had no right to. She served one thing well, and refused to serve it badly. A saffron harbor stew, salt cod and mussels, and the cheapest fish the boats could not sell, cooked so slow it forgot it had ever been cheap. She ladled it into blue enamel bowls with a crack in each one, because a crack, she said, was proof the bowl had been used by someone who loved it. Meme had a saying she used like a knock on a door. Hunger remembers the hand that fed it. She said it to drunks and to the harbor master and to me. She said it the way other people said grace. I did not understand it as a child. I thought it was about being polite. It was not about being polite. I learned to cook by standing at her elbow, which is the only way anyone ever learns anything real. She taught me that a plate is a sentence, and most cooks shout it. She taught me to keep my hands quiet. She taught me that the last thing you do to a dish, the wipe of the rim, the single leaf, the exact center of the bowl, is not decoration, it is a signature. It is you saying, I made this and I stand behind it. That is why they call it plating. That is the part I loved. That is the part. In the great kitchens, they never let the small people do under their own name. I've always cataloged things. It is not a talent, it is a nervous habit, the way some people bite their nails. I catalog because if I have written a thing down in my head, I do not have to feel it yet. I cataloged the harbor counter, 8 stools, the 3rd one wobbled. Meme kept a folded matchbook under it for 11 years rather than fix it. I cataloged the boats by their engines before I could read their names. When my grandmother began to lose her yesterdays, I cataloged those too. Which ones went first, so that I could hand them back to her on the afternoon she reached for them and found the shelf empty. I did not know when I walked into the great house that I was about to meet the most catalogable woman alive, and that cataloging her would be the thing that undid me. Meme got sick the winter I turned 25. Not the fast kind, the slow kind, the kind that takes a person's yesterdays before it takes anything else, so that some afternoons she knew me, and some afternoons I was a kind stranger who cooked the way her granddaughter used to. I moved her into a care home 3 streets up from the water, a pale green room with a window that looked at the masts, and I paid for that window by taking the only job that paid enough, a trial, at Maison Adler. You have to understand what Maison Adler was to someone like me. It was not a restaurant. It was the restaurant, the 3-star house at the top of the trade, and for 2 years it had also been a television show, a glossy documentary series that filmed the past in real time. The tickets, the fear, the woman at the center of it who never once raised her voice. Chef Adler did not need to raise her voice. The whole building lowered itself to hear her. Alphas measured themselves against her and lost. I had watched every episode on my grandmother's failing tablet, in that pale green room, holding her hand while she slept. I thought the frost of the past was the most disciplined person I had ever seen. I did not yet know I was right, or how much that discipline had cost, or who had paid for the first of it. I want to describe her the way I learned to, because I cataloged her before I understood I was doing it. Sévrine Adler wore her hair, a dark espresso so deep it read as black under the pass lamp, scraped straight back and pinned so tight it looked painful. Her eyes were a pale jade gray, the color of sea glass that has given up its green. Her skin was cool and fair and never once flushed, not in the heat of service, not ever. She wore crisp black whites and a charcoal apron tied twice around. And on the inside of her left wrist there was a thin, pale burn scar. Old. The kind you get young and never explain, and when she was holding herself very still, she pressed the pad of her thumb against it. I would learn that thumb better than I knew my own hands. She spoke in short, whole sentences, unhurried, surgical. She let her consommé go cold at the pass every single service and never once drank it. I cataloged that too, the cold cup, long before I let myself wonder why a person makes something warm and refuses to take it. People asked me later what she was like, and I never knew how to answer because the true answer was a list. And lists sound cold to people who have never loved someone by list. She was like the second before a knife touches a board. She was like a kitchen at 4 a.m. with every surface wiped and nothing yet begun. She was like the particular economy of a person who has decided exactly how much of herself the world is allowed to have and has drawn the line in permanent ink. I did not find her beautiful at first. I found her correct. It took me a long time and a great deal of catalog to understand that in her, correctness was the disguise that beauty had been forced to wear to survive. My first 2 weeks, I was furniture. That is the correct word for what a plater is in a house like that. A pair of clean hands at the cold end of the pass. Garde-manger, dressing the plates the alphas above me had cooked, wiping rims, placing the one leaf, never signing. Behind, someone would call and I would step back without looking, because behind is the only word that matters in a kitchen. It means a body and a hot pan are passing where your spine is, and you had better make yourself small. I made myself small very well. I had a lot of practice. The days had a shape, and I learned it fast because learning shapes is the one thing I do without trying. In Before Dawn, the walk-in and the mise, the long climb of prep towards service, the sudden vertical wall of the tickets, the pass under its hot lamp, the slow descent of the clean down, out into a city already asleep. Somewhere in the vertical wall of every service she would appear at the pass, and the temperature of the room would change by a degree you could not measure but everyone felt, and tickets that had been chaos would resolve into order, the way iron filings resolve when you slide a magnet under the paper. I watched it happen from the cold end and thought it was the most impersonal power I had ever seen. I was wrong about the impersonal part. I was wrong about almost everything at the cold end. There was a stage heir named Junie, a bright, breathless thing barely into her 20s, an unpaid intern who had talked her way in on nerve alone and did everything at a run. Junie decided in her first week that we were friends, the way puppies decide things, and there was no arguing with it. She saw the blue enamel bowl in my locker on the 3rd day and would not let it go. "What is that?" she said. "That is nothing," I said. "That is not nothing," she said. "That is the most something I have ever seen, and you should cook whatever goes in it." I told her platers do not cook. She looked at me like I had said the sun does not rise. There was an old woman too, a saucier named Colette who had been at Maison Adler for 40 years, since before the stars, since before the cameras, since before Sévrine Adler was Sévrine Adler. Colette had a silver bun screwed tight to her skull and forearms like a dock worker, and she missed nothing. She watched me plate for 2 weeks without a word. Then one night she tasted a sauce off my thumb, unasked, the way only someone with 40 years can. And she said, "Quiet hands. You were taught by someone who mattered." I said, "My grandmother." Colette nodded once, like a door closing on a warm room, and went back to her station. I did not know then that Colette knew things about that kitchen no camera had ever filmed. A great kitchen is a country with borders, and I had been issued the passport of the lowest province. There were the alphas who cooked the proteins and got the close-ups, and the Sioux who ran the sections, and the old guard like Colette who had tenure the way mountains have tenure. And then there was the cold end, garde-manger, the salads and the plating, and the unglamorous truth that someone has to make the beautiful thing actually reach the table looking like the photograph. I did not resent my province. I had spent my whole life at the humble end of kitchens, and I knew a secret the close-up alphas did not, which is that the last hands on a plate are the ones the guest actually tastes with their eyes, and that a house can be undone at the cold end faster than anywhere else, and that Chef Adler, whatever else was true of her, had put a great deal of her attention on exactly the province everyone else ignored. I noticed that. I noticed it before I had any idea what it meant. The show changed everything, and I did not see it coming. Once a month, the series filmed what they called the open call, a staged, televised tasting where anyone in the brigade, even the furniture, could put up a single dish for the chef, and she would judge it live, and the country would watch her do it. It made careers. It ended more. I had no intention of putting up anything. I had a window to pay for and a grandmother who some afternoons did not know my name. I did not need to be seen. I needed to be employed. I should tell you what the open call did to people, because it is the engine of everything that followed. The show loved it. The country loved it. A nobody in the brigade would put up a plate, and the frost of the past would taste it live and say one true sentence about it. And either that sentence made you or that sentence was played back at you for the rest of your career by everyone who had ever envied you. 2 cooks had left the trade entirely over sentences she had said at that pass. She never said a cruel thing that was not also accurate, which is the only kind of cruelty that sticks. I had watched it happen on my grandmother's failing tablet and thought, from the safe side of a screen, that I would never in my life be foolish enough to stand there. And then a stagiaire with wet eyes and more courage than sense wrote my name on a call sheet. Uni entered me without asking. I found out an hour before, from a call sheet with my name on it in a slot I had not signed up for, and Junie standing behind it with her chin up and her eyes already wet saying, "You are going to hate me for 11 seconds and thank me for the rest of your life." I did not have 11 seconds to spare. I had one dish I could cook without thinking, one dish my hands knew in the dark, and it lived in a blue enamel bowl. So I made my grandmother's stew in the most famous kitchen in the country, while 3 cameras learned my face, because the only other option was to stand there and refuse and be furniture forever. I have gone back to those minutes so many times that they have worn smooth, like Meme's matchbook, like a thumb on a scar. The mise laid out fast on a borrowed cutting board, the saffron blooming in warm broth, turning at the exact gold of the light through the care home window, the muscles opening one by one like small arguments settled. Uni beside me the whole time, not saying a word for once, just handing me things a half second before I reached for them, which is the highest form of love available in a kitchen. And under all of it, the thing I did not let myself think until much later, that I was not cooking to win. I was cooking the only prayer I knew, in the only language I had, in front of a woman I did not yet know had once been kept alive by that exact prayer. I cooked it exactly the way Meme cooked it. I did not elevate it. That was the whole point, though I could not have said so then. You do not improve a thing that is already telling the truth. Saffron and salt cod and mussels and the cheap fish, a slow gold broth, and at the end the wipe of the rim and the single leaf in the exact center. My signature, the only one I was allowed. I carried it to the pass myself. I set it under the lamp, and I watched the frost of the pass look down into my grandmother's bowl and stop being able to breathe. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I doubt the cameras caught it. But I plate for a living, I read the last quiet inch of things, and I saw it. Her jaw, the small muscle there, jumped once and locked. Her thumb went to the scar on her wrist and pressed white. The color did not leave her face because her face had no color to lose. But something behind it drained, some pilot light I had watched flicker for 2 weeks on television. And for one instant, Chef Sévrine Adler looked at a chipped blue bowl like it had reached across 9 years and taken her by the throat. Then she put it away. I watched her put it away. It was the most controlled thing I have ever seen a person do, and I have since seen her do harder ones. She pushed the bowl back across the steel. She picked up a clean spoon and held it out to me, handle first, in front of the cameras, and she said, "Taste it." I said, "Chef?" She said, "You made it. Taste it. Tell the room what you taste." Her voice did not rise. It never rose. That was the cruelty of it. There was nothing to point to. no shout to replay. Only a woman calmly asking a cook to eat her own food on camera and name its faults out loud. So I took the spoon. I tasted my grandmother's stew, the stew I had cooked 10,000 times, and I stood in the most famous kitchen in the country, and I said, in a steady voice I'm still proud of, "It tastes like the sea." And she said, "It tastes like a canteen. Do it over." And she turned to the next cook. "Do it over." 2 words, no heat in them, and the whole brigade exhaled because it had not been aimed at them. Somewhere behind the lights, a woman I did not yet know to fear, silver-haired still, watched the whole thing with her hands folded. And beside her, a sleek, pale blonde alpha smiled at her phone. I did not know their names yet either. I knew only the ringing in my ears and the blue bowl in my 2 hands. And the strange fact that I was not crying, I saved that for later. I am very good at saving it for later. I have thought a great deal since about why I did not cry that night. And I think it is because crying is a thing you do when you have been surprised by pain. And I had not been surprised. I had been raised at a counter that fed the whole harbor, including the people who could not pay, and sometimes including the people who mocked my grandmother for feeding the people who could not pay. And I had learned young that the world will take a soft thing and press on it precisely because it is soft, and that the answer is not to become hard, which is a kind of dying, but to become quiet, which is a kind of waiting. So I did not cry. I waited. I did not know what I was waiting for. It turned out I was waiting for the 2 seconds to make sense, and it would take months, and it would be worth every one of them. Uni cried enough for both of us in the locker room, apologizing in a loop, and I told her the truth, which was that I did not blame her. I have never once blamed Uni. She had shoved me into the light, and the light had done what light does. What I could not explain to her, because I could not yet explain it to myself, was the 2 seconds before the cruelty, the pilot light going out, the thumb on the scar, a woman who had built a fortress out of never wanting anything, looking at a cheap blue bowl like it was the one door in the wall. I almost quit that night. I sat on the floor of my rented room, a room the size of a walk-in, with the blue bowl in my lap and did the arithmetic of leaving. The math was simple. I could not afford dignity. The window with the masts in it cost more than my pride. And Meme, on her good afternoons, still asked if the boats had come in, and I had promised her a window she could ask it from. So I washed the bowl and dried it and set it on the sill, and I went back the next day. Because that is what the arithmetic said. I did not go back for Sévrine Adler. I want that on the record. I went back for a window. I expected to be furniture again. Instead, at the end of a brutal service, Chef Adler said, without looking up from the pass, "Fenn, stay." The kitchen emptied around us with the particular speed of people who do not want to witness a hanging. When it was just the 2 of us, and the ticking of the cooling steel, she finally looked at me. Off camera, her eyes were worse, because there was no performance in them, only that pale jade attention turned all the way up. She said, "You are wasted at the cold end." I said nothing. She said, "You will work the private pass, mine, starting tomorrow." I still said nothing, because I had learned that day exactly how her quiet worked, and I was not going to hand her my gratitude across the same steel she had pushed the bowl back on. She noticed the silence. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. She said, "No, thank you." I said, "No, chef." She said, "Good." She pressed her thumb to the scar on her wrist once, and I catalogued it, and then she said the thing I turned over for weeks. She said, "Correctness is not kindness. Do not confuse them here." Then she untied her apron, which I would learn was the only time she ever looked like a person. And she left. And I stood alone in the cleanest, dangerous room I had ever been in, and understood that I had just been promoted by the woman who had humiliated me 8 hours earlier, and that I did not understand a single thing that was happening to me. I told Uni about the promotion, and she screamed in the locker room, and then went quiet and said the smartest thing she ever said to me, which was, "That is not a reward, Odie. That is a hiding place." I asked her what she meant. She could not say. She was 22 and running on nerve, and she did not have the words, but she had the instinct, and her instinct was correct, and it would be months before I caught up to it. A hiding place. She had looked at a promotion to the most coveted station in the country and seen it for what it was before I did, because she was watching Sévrine's face when the offer was made, and I was watching the steal. The private pass was a different world, colder and quieter and closer. It was a narrow steel room off the main kitchen, where Chef Adler developed the menu, where the cameras were not allowed, where it was often just the two of us for hours, with a problem between us instead of a wall. I learned her there the way you learn a language by immersion, badly at first and then all at once. I learned that she arrived before everyone and left after. I learned that she tasted with a small, unhurried movement and closed her eyes for exactly 1 second and never longer. I learned that when a dish was wrong, she did not say wrong, she said again. And when it was right, she said nothing at all, which was worse and better, because you spent your whole life chasing that nothing. I should say plainly that I was good at the work, because false modesty is its own kind of lie, and my grandmother had no patience for lies of any temperature. I was good. I had hands that had been trained by a woman who cooked one thing perfectly for 40 years, and there is no school on earth that gives you that. And the private pass was the first place in my working life where being good was not a liability to be managed, but a currency someone actually wanted. She worked me hard. She corrected me constantly. And underneath the correction, so quiet, I did not trust it at first, there was the thing I had wanted my whole life and never once received from a kitchen. I was being taken seriously. It is a small phrase for an enormous thing. She took me seriously. Before she ever took my hand, she took me seriously, and I am not certain the second would have meant anything without the first. The first week at the private pass passed in a suspended quiet, a room run by a woman I could not read and could not stop reading. She would set a problem on the steel, a sauce that broke, a garnish that lied, a plate that said the wrong sentence, and we would solve it without touching, without small talk, a careful 18 inches of steel between her hands and mine at all times. I began to catalog the 18 inches. I began to notice that she maintained them as deliberately as I did. Two people do not hold the exact same distance by accident. A wall is built from both sides. I want to be honest about the 18 inches, because a person who has never worked a pass will think I am being romantic, and I am not. 18 inches is not a metaphor. It is the working distance of a shared station, the exact span at which two cooks can hand each other a plate without touching hands, and every kitchen in the world runs on it. And it is completely ordinary, and that is precisely what made ours unbearable. Because ordinary distance held on purpose stops being distance and becomes a decision. And a decision made every hour of every night for months stops being a decision and becomes a vow. And neither of us had said a single word. And both of us were, by then, thoroughly and silently married to the not reaching. By the second week, I understood the cold consommé. She made it every morning, a small cup of something warm at her elbow, and she never drank it. She let it go cold beside the work. And one morning, I could not help myself, and I moved it closer to her hand. And she looked at the cup and looked at me and did not drink it. But she also did not move it back. And after that, there was always a cold cup between us going cold on purpose, a small ritual neither of us named. I have thought about that cup more than I have thought about most kisses I have had. It said everything the 18 inches were built to prevent. There were other small objects, and I collected them the way I collect everything. A grease pencil she kept behind her right ear and forgot was there, so that by the end of a long night there was always a faint gray line at her temple, where she had pushed back a loose strand. And I wanted, with an intensity that frightened me, to be the one allowed to wipe it away. The old carbon steel knife with a bone handle worn to the shape of her grip, the only knife she used, older than the stars. And I understood without being told that it had come from before, from the bad years, that it was the one thing she had carried up out of the pure winter. A woman who owns 100 perfect knives and cooks with one battered one is telling you exactly where her heart is buried if you know how to read a station, and I knew how to read a station. On the fourth night, she came back late, after I thought she had gone, and found me still there, plating a staff meal for the closing crew because no one else would bother to. She watched me wipe the rim and place the one leaf in the center, my grandmother's signature, the thing I was not allowed to do on any plate that left that house under a name. She said, "Where did you learn to finish a plate like that?" I said, "My grandmother." She went very still. She said, "The bowl." I said, "The bowl." And she pressed her thumb to the scar and said nothing else, and I lay awake that night turning it over, the way she had said the bowl, like the word cost her something, like she had been introduced to it before. The next morning she did a thing she had never done. She tasted my staff meal broth in front of the closing crew, a plater's broth beneath her, a thing no 3-star chef tastes. And she did not say again. And she did not say nothing. She said, "To the room, not to me. That is how a broth should taste." And then she left before I could arrange my face. The crew stared at me. Uni made a sound like a kettle. I stood at the pass with a ladle in my hand and understood that she had just done, in public, the most reckless thing I had yet seen her do, and that she had done it for me, and that she had left immediately so that neither of us would have to survive the aftermath of it together. I cataloged the recklessness, and I added it to the picture. And the picture got warmer and more frightening at the same time. The restraint of those months is the part I do not know how to make people believe, because nothing happened in it. And everything did. Weeks went by. We did not touch. We stood 18 inches apart over the same cloth of steel and solved beautiful problems and let a cup go cold between us. And the not touching became the loudest thing in my life. I want to tell you about the small events, because the small events were the whole marriage of it, and there was no other kind. The first small event was the menu. I began to find my own hands in it, a wipe of a rim that was mine, a single leaf placed in a center that was mine, a way of turning a mussel so the light caught the inside of the shell, that I had learned at a harbor counter and had put into a staff meal one night. And 3 weeks later, it walked out of Maison Adler on a plate that cost more than I made in a night, under no name, under the house name, which is to say, under hers. It kept happening. And each time it happened, I understood a little more and forgave a little less, and then slowly forgave a great deal more than I had ever forgiven anyone. A way I trimmed a herb, a temperature I liked a sauce held at, 1/2 degree warmer than the classical, the harbor way, the way that tastes like a kitchen and not a laboratory, the angle of a single leaf. One by one, my grandmother's decisions walked out of that house on the country's most expensive plates, wearing the house's name like a borrowed coat. And one by one, I stopped being able to tell myself a clean story about theft, because a thief takes a thing to keep it. And this woman was taking my hands and giving them away to the world as fast as she could, unsigned, untraceable, seated so deep into the menu that even if she were destroyed tomorrow, some part of Rosa Fenn would go on being served in that room for as long as the room stood. That is not theft. I did not have a word for what that was. I have one now. It is the oldest word there is. The first time I saw it, I stood at the pass and could not speak. My grandmother's finish, on the country's most famous plate, unsigned, seated into the house so quietly that no one would ever be able to pull it out again. I did not know yet whether that was theft or something else. I turned it over for days. She was taking my signature and unsigning it, folding my grandmother's hands into her house, where they could never be traced back to a plater. It looked exactly like theft. It also looked, if you tilted it a certain way I did not yet dare to tilt it, like a woman hiding something valuable in the one place no one would think to raid, a seam sewn on the inside, a thing kept by being given away. Colette found me at the pass the night I first saw my own finish leave the kitchen, and she read my face the way she read a sauce. She said low over a pair of good scissors, "You have seen it then, the house eating out of your hands." I said, "She is stealing it." Colette laughed, one dry note. Colette said, "Girl, in 40 years I have watched that woman refuse to want a single thing in front of a single witness. If she is putting your hands on her plates, she is not stealing from you. She is hiding you inside the only thing they cannot take from her. I said, "Who is they?" Colette set down the scissors and looked at me a long moment, 40 years in her face, and she said, "Ask her what she kept." Then she would say no more. The first week after that, I did not sleep well, and I filled the not sleeping with catalog. I lay in my walk-in room with the blue bowl on the sill, and I laid out everything I had collected and turned each piece over looking for the join. The 2 seconds at the open call, the bowl, the word bowl, the way it cost her. More salt cod, it is thin at the back, said by smell, from across the station, in language that had only ever lived in one place on earth. The single battered knife, the cold cup she made warm and would not drink. It was beginning to make a picture, and the picture was not the one the country watched on television. And I was afraid of the picture, because if it was true, then the woman I had cataloged as cruel had been the entire time the most quietly generous person I had ever stood next to. And I did not know how to hold that and keep my perimeter, and I very much needed to keep my perimeter. Ask her what she kept. I did not ask. I was a coward about it for weeks, because I had begun to suspect the shape of the answer, and the shape frightened me. Instead, I cataloged. The thumb to the scar, the cold cup, the espresso hair coming loose by the end of a long night, one strand she never fixed. The way her voice, which never rose for the brigade, went even quieter for me, down to almost nothing, so that to hear her I had to lean into the 18 inches, and she let me, and neither of us said that she let me. There was a night it nearly broke. A late fitting of a new dish, both of us tired past the point where the fortress holds, and our hands met on the plate, actually met, her fingers over mine on the cold rim of it, and neither of us moved for the length of a held breath, and the whole 18 inches collapsed to nothing and hung there. And I felt her decide. I felt the exact half-second in which the frost of the past stood on the edge of the water and looked in. And then she drew her hand back, slow, and pressed her thumb to the scar, and said, so quietly, it was barely sound, "Not yet. Not no, just not yet." And I understood that not yet was a promise and a wall at the same time, and that she was protecting something by not reaching, the same thing I was protecting, and that we were, the two of us, guarding a fire by refusing to touch it, and that this was the most either of us had ever said "I love you" to another living person. The second small event was that she was funny. No one on the television knew this. The frost of the pass, alone at midnight with a broken sauce, was dry and quick and unkind about exactly the right people. And one night she said something so precisely cruel about a famous critic that I laughed out loud before I could stop it. A real laugh, the first one to escape me in that building. And she looked up startled to have been heard, and something happened at the corner of her mouth. A millimeter. I cataloged the millimeter. I cataloged it the way a sailor catalogs the first inch of a tide. After the laugh, something shifted in the register of the room, so slightly that only a person who plates for a living would have caught it. She began to talk to me. Not much, never about herself. But she would set a problem on the steel, and then, while we worked it, she would say a thing. About a cook she had loved and lost to another house, about a service years ago that had gone perfectly and meant nothing about why the classical version of a dish was wrong and had always been wrong. And I understood that I was being given something, that these small dry offerings were the most she knew how to give, that a woman who had decided exactly how much of herself the world could have was, in a cold steel room at midnight, quietly and terrifyingly revising the figure upward one sentence at a time, only for me. The third small event was that she began to leave the private pass door open when it was just us, though the door had always been closed, and I understood without being told that the closed door had been the wall, and the open door was a quarter inch of it coming down, and that she had opened it and was watching to see if I would notice. And I noticed everything, and I let her see that I noticed. And we stood in that open door for weeks like two people standing at the edge of very cold water, neither willing to be the one who ruined the discipline of not going in. Colette caught me watching the open door one night and did not tease me, which frightened me more than teasing would have. She dried her hands and came and stood beside me and looked at the door too, at Sévrine's back bent over the past beyond it, and she said, very low, I have worked for that woman since she was a stray they dragged in half dead and gave a knife to out of pity. She said, in all those years, I have watched her keep every person in this building at exactly the length of a blade. She said, you are inside the blade, girl. I do not think she knows how to make you leave, and I do not think she will ever tell you to stay. Because the last time she let herself want a thing where the wrong person could see it, they took it. And she has been paying for that lesson ever since. Ask her what she kept. Then Colette went home, and I stood at the open door, and I did not ask, because I was learning that some questions are doors you cannot close again once you open them. Somewhere in there, I stopped being able to lie to myself about the flashback I was assembling, because I had begun to notice how much she knew about a harbor counter she had never set foot in. She knew that saffron should go in twice. She knew that the cheap fish was the honest fish. One night she corrected my broth without tasting it from across the steel by smell and said, more salt cod. It is thin at the back. And she was right. And there was only one place on earth I had ever heard a broth described as thin at the back. And it was a narrow counter with 8 stools where an old woman said it about the boat's worst days. I looked at her and she saw me looking, and she pressed her thumb to the scar and turned away. And I did not ask because I am a coward, and because some part of me already knew that when I asked, everything would change, and I was not ready for everything to change. I went to see Meme that Sunday, my one afternoon, and it was a bad day, one of the ones where I was a kind stranger. She held my hand and told me, carefully, as if I might not know, about her granddaughter, who was a wonderful cook, who had gone away to the city to work in a grand kitchen for a cold, famous woman off the television. She said, I hope that woman is kind to her. And then she said, drifting, looking at the masts, we used to feed a thin girl. Every winter has a thin girl. You must always feed her, even when the till is empty, especially then. Hunger remembers the hand that fed it, and I sat in a pale green room holding the hand that had, without ever knowing it, made the woman I could not stop cataloging. And I understood that the whole story had been written years before I was standing in it, in a language of saffron and salt, by a woman who was now handing me back my own life as a story about a stranger. And I put my head down by her hand, and I did not correct her. So the weeks went on and we held it. I have tried to describe holding it to people and they hear self-denial, a sad thing. 2 people wasting time. It was not that. It was the opposite of wasting. Every night we did not reach across the 18 inches. The thing between us got denser and truer and more entirely ours, because it was made only of choice, with no accident in it anywhere, no wine, no dark, no excuse we could blame in the morning. A single reach can be an accident. A held perimeter month after month is the least accidental thing 2 people can build. We were building it in the only place we were allowed to build anything. In the 18 inches, in the cold cup, in the open door, in the single leaf placed just so. And I would not trade those months for any easier version of this story. And I have been offered easier versions. And I have said no every time. There is one night I have never told anyone about, and I will tell it now because it is the truest thing I know about that whole long winter of not reaching. She fell asleep. Sévrine Adler, who arrived before everyone and left after, who I did not believe required sleep the way ordinary people require it, put her head down on her folded arms at the private pass at 3 a.m. over a dish that would not come right and slept for 11 minutes, and I stood 18 inches away and did not wake her and did not move closer and did not do a single one of the things my whole body was asking to do. I catalogued her instead, The loose strand, the gray line at her temple from the grease pencil, the thumb, even in sleep, resting against the scar. And when the 11 minutes were up, she woke without a sound, already at attention, and looked at me to see if I had seen anything. And I had seen everything. And I let my face show her none of it, because that was the gift she could actually receive. And love, I was learning, is mostly the discipline of giving people the version of your love they can survive. The crisis, when it came, did not come from us. It came from money, the way these things do. There was a woman named Ines Garnier, silver and iron, still the chair and owner of the group that owned Maison Adler, the folded hands behind the lights at the open call. And there was Vivienne Pell, sleek and pale blonde and 32, the heir of the investment house Garnier was merging with, an alpha who smiled at her phone while people were destroyed in front of her. The merger had a condition, the way old money always does. It had a marriage. Sévrine Adler, the face of the group's crown jewel, was to be bonded to Vivienne Pell at the group's winter gala, on camera, a corporate marriage dressed as a fairy tale. And the whole machine had been building toward it for a year, while I stood 18 inches away, learning the tide of a woman's mouth, and thinking, like a fool, that time was a thing we had. I learned it the way you learn the worst things, sideways, from Vivienne herself. She came into the private pass one afternoon like she owned it, which she nearly did, and she looked at me the way you look at a coat you are deciding whether to keep, and she said, "So you are the Harbor Stray's little project?" I said nothing. She smiled. She said, "Do you know she was nothing when Ines found her? Less than nothing. A blacklisted line cook sleeping under a pier 9 years ago. A scandal, a fire she took the blame for. Ines made her, and Ines can unmake her. And the price of not being unmade is me." Vivienne looked at the cold cup going cold between us, and something in her face understood exactly what it was, and did not like it. She said, "Whatever this is, Plater, it ends at the gala." Then she left, and I stood there with the whole shape of it finally in my hands, and it was worse than I had let myself imagine. And it was also, God help me, an answer. I want to be fair to Vivienne Pell, which is hard, because she was not fair to anyone, but she was not stupid, and she had understood something I was still refusing to understand, which is that a cold cup going cold between two people is louder than any shout. She had walked into the private pass and read the room in 4 seconds and known exactly what she was up against. And it was not a Plater. It was a 9-year debt wearing an apron. She could not fight that with charm. So she went to get the one weapon that beats love in that world every time, which is a person who prices things. And she brought that weapon down on us as fast as she could. And I do not entirely blame her because I had, without meaning to, taken something she had been promised. And people are rarely gracious about that. And she was never going to be the exception. A blacklisted line cook, sleeping under a pier, 9 years ago. I did the arithmetic the way I do all arithmetic, cold and exact, and it came out to the winter I was 17, turning 18. The winter a thin young woman with terrible eyes and no name started coming to my grandmother's counter after midnight, when the stools were empty, and sat at the far end and did not order because she had nothing. And my grandmother, without a word, without ever once asking her name, put a blue enamel bowl of saffron stew in front of her every night for a whole winter, and told me to keep the change from a till that had received no coins. Hunger remembers the hand that fed it. I had thought it was a saying. It was an address. It was a person. It was her. I did not sleep. I lay in my walk-in room with the blue bowl on the sill, catching the harbor light, and I put it together seam by seam. She had been the stray. My grandmother had fed her through the worst winter of her life, in that bowl, that exact bowl, or its twin, and had never asked her name, and had sent her back into the world alive. 9 years later, a chipped blue bowl had come across her pass on television, and reached across the whole distance of her rebuilt life and taken her by the throat, and she had not been able to breathe. And then she had put it away and pushed it back and humiliated me on camera because Ines Garnier was watching, and Vivienne Pell was watching, and the whole country was watching. And the one thing the frost of the past could not afford to be seen doing was wanting something. Because in that house, whatever Sévrine Adler was seen to love, Ines Garnier priced and sold and used. I was not the stray. I was the stray's granddaughter. And she had spent months hiding me inside her menu, unsigning my hands into her plates, keeping me behind her, because behind her was the only safe place in the building, and she had built the whole fortress precisely so that she would have one. I understood finally what the cruelty had been. It had been the wall thrown up fast in front of the cameras, the only shelter she had time to build. Do it over had meant stay. Taste it had meant I know exactly what this is, and I cannot let this room see me know it. Every cold correction across the steel had been a hand on my back saying, "Small, small, make yourself small. Let me keep you where they cannot see how much you are worth to me." I had catalogued a woman being cruel. I had been cataloging a woman standing in front of me in a burning building holding the only door. I still did not go to her. This is the part I am least proud of and most sure was right, because I had also understood the trap, and understanding it did not spring it. If I went to her, if we closed the 18 inches, then Vivienne was correct, and the merger's whole logic broke, and Ines Garnier would do what Ines Garnier did. She would price it. She would find the blue bowl. She would find Meme 3 streets from the water in a pale green room, and my window with the mass in it, and she would make all of it a lever. Loving her out loud would not free either of us. It would just hand a cold woman a new thing to sell. So I held the perimeter. I held it harder than I have ever held anything. I held it the way my grandmother held a slow broth, refusing to rush the one thing that could not be rushed. And it was the hardest cooking I have ever done. And I did none of it with my hands. Vivienne, watching us hold it, mistook the holding for surrender and grew careless. And that was the crack that let the light in. She went to Ines. Of course she did. She told her there was a plater with quiet hands in a blue bowl, that the great chef Adler had been caught wanting after all, that the crown jewel had a soft place with a granddaughter's name on it, and Ines Garnier, who priced everything, moved to sell it. I know how that conversation went because I was made to stand in it. I was summoned to the private pass on a gray Monday. Of course it was a Monday, the worst business is always a Monday. And Ines Garnier was there, folded hands, still as furniture that owns the house, and Vivienne beside her, and Sévrine standing with both hands flat on the steel and her head slightly down, a posture I had never seen in her, the posture of a woman bracing. I had never seen her brace before. That is the detail that told me how bad it was. In every service, in every crisis, through broken sauces and failed proteins, and a critic taken ill at table 4 one memorable night, Sévrine Adler had stood at her pass with the particular unbraced stillness of a woman nothing could reach. And now, in her own private room, in front of a silver woman with folded hands, she stood with both palms flat on the steel, and her head slightly down, and her shoulders set, braced, the way you stand when something is going to hit you. And the only choice left is where you take it. She was not bracing for herself. I understood that with total clarity. She had already decided to take the hit standing between it and me, and she was bracing so that when it landed she would not move, so that I would not see her move, so that the room would read her stillness as indifference and leave the plater alone. She was one more time holding the only door. Ines did not raise her voice either. It runs in the money, that quiet. She looked at me the way you read a receipt and she said the plater is talented. The plater is also a distraction and a liability, and I am told sentimental about a bowl. She will be reassigned out of the group by Friday. The gala will proceed, the bond will be announced, and Chef Adler will, I am sure, plate the harbor dish she has been so quietly perfecting, as the show's finale, under the house name, where it belongs. Under the house name, where it belongs. She was going to take my grandmother's stew, the bowl that had fed a starving girl who grew up to be her crown jewel, the one honest thing in that entire glittering machine, and serve it to the country at a wedding I was to be swept out of by Friday, unsigned, unsourced, unremembered, a stolen sentence in someone else's mouth. And Sévrine, hands flat on the steel, said nothing. She did not look at me. Her thumb was white against the scar. I understood she was doing the same arithmetic I had done, that fighting for me out loud was the one move that would guarantee they came for Meme and the window and all of it. She was holding the door again. She was going to let them sweep me out to keep them from finding the room behind her. And I found that I could not let her hold it alone anymore. And I also could not let them serve my grandmother under a thief's name. And those two refusals turned out to be the same refusal. So I chose the harder road. I did not break down. I did not beg. I looked at Ines Garnier and I said, in Meme's steady voice, the one I am proud of, I will go Friday. You are right, that I am a distraction, but you will not serve that dish at your gala. She actually blinked. She said, I beg your pardon. I said, the recipe is not the house's. It is not even the chef's. It belongs to a woman named Rosa Fenn, who fed a blacklisted stray under a pier for one whole winter 9 years ago and never asked her name, in a chip blue bowl, for free. If you serve it, you will be serving stolen bread at your own wedding, and one day someone will stand up and say so. I looked at Sévrine then, and I said, the whole room hearing it, do not let them crown you with a thing you stole. You are better than the woman who taught you to hide. And I put my apron on the steel, and I walked out because I was not going to be anyone's evidence, and I was not going to watch her be careful about me one more time. That was Wednesday. I did not sleep Wednesday, and I did not sleep Thursday. Friday, I packed the blue bowl in its padded box, and I went to say goodbye to my grandmother. And it was a good afternoon, one of the ones where she knew me, and she asked if the boats had come in, and I said, yes, Meme, they all came in. And she held my hand and said, out of nowhere, out of the fog, clear as a bell, did you feed the thin girl, the one who never orders? Feed her, Odette. Hunger remembers. And I put my face in the blanket by her hand so she would not see. And I said, yes, Meme. I fed her. I fed her all winter, which was a lie because it had been my grandmother's hand, not mine, and also somehow not a lie at all. Sévrine came to my room that night. Out of the whites. That is the detail I keep. She stood in the doorway of a room the size of a walk-in in an ordinary gray coat. No apron to untie. No pass between us. No cameras. No steel. Nothing built. And she looked smaller and more dangerous than I had ever seen her, because there was nothing left to hold, and she had come anyway. She said my name, not Fenn. She said Odette. It was the first time. I had not known she had it. She said I was going to let them take you Friday. I said, I know. She said, I have spent 9 years making sure I could never be taken by anything again, and I built it well. And then an old woman's bowl came across my pass, and I understood I had already been taken years ago and had only been pretending otherwise. She reached into the gray coat, and she took out something wrapped in a service cloth, and she unwrapped it with hands that were not quite steady, and it was a bowl, blue enamel, chipped, a hairline crack glazed over by hand. Not mine, I had mine on the sill, but its twin, the one that had been set in front of her every night of the worst winter of her life, that she had stolen from a harbor counter out of shame and carried through 9 years in 3 cities and never once eaten from again. She said, I never asked her name. I have been ashamed of that for 9 years. Tell me her name. I said Rosa Fenn, Meme. She held the bowl in both hands like it might still be warm, and the frost of the pass. The woman who never flushed, who let every warm thing she ever made go cold on purpose, finally let something be warm in her hands, and she wept without a sound, which is the only way she ever did anything. I want to tell you what she said then, because it was the longest I ever heard her speak, and she said it fast and low with her thumb white on the scar, the way you confess a thing you have carried too long to carry it one more step. She said, I told myself I hid you to protect you, and that was true. And it was also a lie, because I hid you the way I hide everything, out of the old terror that anything I am seen to love will be taken and priced and used against me. She said, your grandmother fed me for a winter and asked nothing, and I have spent 9 years turning that into a fortress instead of an example. She said, You stood in front of Ines Garnier and told me not to let them crown me with a stolen thing. And you were right. And no one has told me the truth to my face since a woman with a chipped bowl looked at me under a pier and did not ask my name. She said, "I do not know how to do this. I have never once done this." And I said, "I know. I catalog. I will hand you back the pieces on the days you cannot find them. It is the only thing I know how to do. And it turns out it is the thing you need." I crossed the room. There were no 18 inches left to hold, and I had held them for so many months that closing them felt like setting down something I had carried across a country. I took the bowl out of her hands and set it on the sill beside its twin, so that they sat together in the harbor light for the first time in 9 years. And then I took her wrist, the left one, the scar, and I pressed my thumb to it the way she pressed hers, and she made a sound like a held breath finally let out. And I put my forehead against hers, and her hand came up to my jaw, and for the first time in the whole long tide of it, neither of us stepped back. And this is where I have to stop, because what happened next was never meant for YouTube. If you want the uncut version, it's waiting on my Patreon. The link is in the description. The Winter Gala was the most beautiful room I have ever seen, and every camera in the city was in it. Chandeliers, 100 years of them, ice and gold. The group in its finest, Ines Garnier at the center like a blade in velvet, Vivienne Pell in pale silk waiting to be married to a crown jewel, and the country watching live, because the show had promised a wedding, and the show always delivered. I stood in the service corridor in my own clothes, not swept out after all, because Sévrine had asked me to stay for 1 hour, and I had said yes, 1 hour, and I had not asked what for, because I had learned to trust the tide of her. She was supposed to come out and announce the bond. That was the run of the show, printed on 100 call sheets. Instead, she came out in her black whites, not a gown. In her whites, at her own wedding, with a charcoal apron tied twice around. And she carried a tray, and on the tray were bowls, chipped blue enamel bowls, a dozen of them, then 2 dozen. The kitchen carrying them out behind her, and she set them down the long tables in front of the richest people in the country. And she took the microphone, and the room went so quiet you could hear the ice settle. She said, "Tonight you were promised a marriage." She said, "You will forgive me. I am going to feed you instead." She said, 9 years ago I was blacklisted and broke and sleeping under a pier 3 streets from the water. And I had given up. There was a counter with 8 stools run by a woman named Rosa Fenn. Every night that winter, she put a bowl of this in front of me and never asked my name and never took my money, because she had none of mine to take and would not have taken it if I had. She kept me alive out of a chipped blue bowl. Everything I have built, every star, every plate you have ever envied me is hers. I have spent 9 years too ashamed to say her name out loud. Her name is Rosa Fenn, and she reached down into the wings, and she found my hand, and she drew me out into the light in front of every camera in the city, and she said, "And this is Odette Fenn, her granddaughter. She has quiet hands." She taught this whole house to finish a plate, and I let you believe it was me. She is the best cook in this room, and I am not marrying anyone tonight, because I have been in love with the hands that fed me since before I knew whose they were, and I am done being careful about it. Ines Garnier rose, silver and iron, quiet as ever, and she said into the terrible listening room, "Sévrine, think very carefully. Everything you have is mine to withdraw." And Sévrine Adler untied her apron, the only time she ever looked like a person, and she set it on the table between them, and she said, "Then withdraw it. I would rather cook this out of a blue bowl on a harbor for the rest of my life than plate one more beautiful lie for you." She took off the fortress in front of all of them. She had built it for 9 years, and she set it down in 10 seconds. And the room, the cameras, the country saw a 3-star chef choose a plater and a chipped bowl over an empire. And there is no editing that. I have watched the footage. Everyone has. It went everywhere. You can see the exact moment the room stops being a wedding and becomes something no one at the group had budgeted for. You can see Ines Garnier's hands unfold, just slightly, the only time I ever saw them do it. You can see Vivienne set down her glass with great care, the way you set down a thing when your hands want to throw it. And you can see Sévrine, in her whites, with a chipped blue bowl in front of the whole watching country, look happier and more terrified than any chef has ever looked on that channel, because she had just done the one thing she had spent 9 years and 3 stars making certain she would never have to do, which was to let the world see precisely how much she loved something, and to trust it not to be taken. It was the bravest thing I have ever watched a person do. She did it for a bowl of soup and a plater with quiet hands. She did it for me. Vivienne Pell walked out. The merger died on the floor of that ballroom, and Ines Garnier, who priced everything, stood in front of a thing that would not be priced, and for the first time in the whole story, did not know what a thing was worth. Sévrine turned to me in the ringing quiet, in front of all of them, and she did not say she loved me. She had already said it. She said the thing that meant it more. She picked up one of the blue bowls and put a spoon in it and held it out to me, handle first, the way she had on the first day when it was a weapon, and it was not a weapon now. She said, in front of every camera in the city, so quietly that they all had to lean in the way I had learned to lean. Taste it. Tell the room what you taste. And I took the spoon and I tasted my grandmother's stew, served at last under its own true name. And I said, "It tastes like the sea." And Sévrine Adler said, "The frost of the past, the woman who never flushed, flushing at last in a room full of light. It tastes like coming home." And then, so only I could hear it, she said, "Yes, chef." We did not keep the empire, because there was no empire to keep. It was Ines Garnier's, and she took it, all of it, the stars and the show and the great cold kitchen, and she was welcome to it. What she could not take was the only thing that had ever mattered in it, which had never been hers, which had come in on love and left on love. We took that. Meme had a good day the following spring, one of the ones where she knew us both, and we brought her down to the water in a chair, to a narrow counter with 8 stools that we had bought with the last of nothing and painted ourselves. She looked at Sévrine a long time, and I was afraid. And then she said, "The thin girl, you came back." And Sévrine knelt down beside the chair, the woman who knelt to no one. And she said, "I came back, Rosa. I brought your bowl home." And she had. 2 of them, chipped blue enamel, sitting on the counter in the harbor light, cracks and all. Because a crack is proof a thing was used by someone who loved it. We run the counter now, the 2 of us. One thing, done well. Saffron and salt cod and the cheap, honest fish in blue bowls. And we do not let anyone go hungry who cannot pay. Because hunger remembers the hand that fed it. And we have both been on the receiving end of that particular memory. And neither of us has ever gotten over it. She is still the most disciplined person I have ever known. She still lets her coffee go cold, but she does not let the warm things go cold anymore, not the ones that count, and the 18 inches are gone, and the door stays open, and she calls me chef now, in the small kitchen, dry and quiet, half a joke and entirely true. Last night I made the stew the way Meme taught me, slow, unhurried. The last thing I do, the wipe of the rim and the one leaf in the exact center, my signature, allowed at last. I carried it to where she sat at the counter in the harbor light, and I set it in front of her in a chipped blue bowl, and I put a spoon in it and held it out, handle first. And Sévrine Adler looked up at me, the whole 9 years and the whole long tide of it in her pale jade eyes, and she took the spoon, and she tasted it, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, no longer, the way she does. And then she opened them, and she looked at me, the way she has looked at me since the day a bowl reached across her pass and took her by the throat. And she said the only 2 words that have ever mattered between us. She said, "Taste it. Dort use, one lande."